to go across now to Ravi Agarwal. He is the editor of Foreign Policy magazine, one of the most well-regarded journals on foreign policy globally. So thank you very much, Ravi, for joining us. How did the pollsters and the pundits get it wrong a third time over? They failed to predict the Donald Trump victory in 2016. Then they said, okay, we've started adding weights. We now account for voters who vote Trump but may not be willing to say so publicly. And yet they seem to have made the same mistake. Is this just liberal media bias at play?
Well, the pollsters are going to say, Rahul, that they didn't quite get it wrong, that the way probability and predictions work, in the last few days, they were saying there's roughly an even chance of either candidate winning. So, of course, when you say that and one of the candidates wins, you're allowed to spin it and say, well, half of our projections suggested that that was the case. I think your point about underweighting Trump support is a problem that pollsters have faced ever since Trump emerged. Let's face it, he is a unique political phenomenon. He's very different from anything American history has had before. His supporters are less likely to pick up the phone. During the pandemic, his supporters were less likely to be at home. In fact, Biden's supporters were much more likely to be cooped up at home, wearing their masks, answering phones, and diligently responding to surveys and polls. So there are a whole set of reasons, I think, that pollsters are going to try and explore and understand and analyze. I'm not quite ready to, just point the finger at them. This is challenging. And you will know this from India as well, Rahul. Very difficult to predict outcomes in messy, big, large democracies.
Sure. What do you expect internally within the United States from this Trump presidency? How is it likely to be different from what we saw from 2016 to 2020?
So there are several things here. I think Trump this time is much more aware of what the presidency means. I think in as much as he will put in place people who are loyalists, yes men even, he's much more likely to have a clearer sense of what he wants to achieve and how to get there. We've all heard about the policies he wants to put in place, whether it is heightened tariffs on every country on earth, especially China, whether it is, being more transactional in relationships with various countries. All of that, I think there are constraints. We still don't know how the House has turned out. We also don't know, if he has, enough of a filibuster, for example, to push through unilaterally things that he wants to do. So it's not like there are no constraints, but we are entering an era, I think, where the presidency and one party is much stronger than it's ever been, and they have an agenda. The question is whether they will go too far with that agenda. And the question, I think, as well, is how prepared is the rest of the world to deal with all the things that they've been talking about with Trump for many years, particularly Europe, I think, which is deeply concerned about Trump's commitment to alliances, NATO, and Trump's willingness to keep helping Ukraine.
Women were expected to vote disproportionately in favor of Kamala Harris. The data suggests amongst white women, Donald Trump has a 5-point advantage for 52 versus 47. Amongst black women, which is a far smaller percentage of the American population, Kamala Harris leads by a big percentage. But amongst 37% of the voters, which is white women, you've got Trump leading. What explains Kamala Harris not being able to pull white women away from Donald Trump?
So I should caution here, a lot of this exit poll data could change over time. But from what we know so far, all of the data you're citing is what we have. Several things. I think on reproductive freedom and abortion, for example, which has been such a big issue in the 2022 midterms, for example, maybe it could be that voters felt that they could leave things to their states. So I think to truly understand their decision making, you have to look down the ballot and see, what they did and exactly where they voted from. And how that moved the needle for them. But I think more broadly, in any electoral result, it's really important to look at it with humility. And, ultimately, the people get what they want, right? And so it's going to be very important for Democrats and for Harris and whoever, the Democratic Party is going to have to remake itself after this, despite pulling together the broadest coalition possible from AOC on the left to Cheney on the right, despite that broad coalition, they're going to have to rethink, what do Americans want? Do Americans perceive that the Democratic Party looks down on them? Do, and I think at a much deeper level, Rahul, and we can get into this, do enough Americans feel that the system isn't serving them? I think one way to look at this vote is a real sense across this country that people feel that the system just doesn't work for them. It's too hard to get on the housing market. It is too hard to send your kids to college. It is too hard to keep up with the Joneses. Inequality is really bad in the United States. And then lastly, I would say, Rahul, incumbency has hurt a number of leaders around the world, including in India, but in democracies across the globe in 2024, this has not been a good year to be in power and to approach elections. Some of that actually is because of the pandemic and stimulus plans after the pandemic, which has led to high inflation.
But the difference is that in India, the vote and seat tally just took a bit of a hit, but Prime Minister Modi still continues to be in power, unlike the level of anti-incumbency we saw in the United States, where 3 out of 4 voters said they were very unhappy with the direction which the world was going, with which America was going. Let's spend a moment on what to expect outside the United States. When it comes to India, do you think between Harris and Donald Trump, India's got the verdict they would have preferred?
I mean, I think Indians should feel very confident in the fact that there is broad bipartisan agreement in Washington, in the United States, about the importance of the Indo-US relationship. We know this, from a previous Trump term, but also, from several presidents going back now to the 90s, I would say. The trajectory of this relationship is solid, is robust, is strong, and is strategic. It is not just based on the whims of one leader on either side. So I think the trajectory is good. Trump, however, is mercurial. He likes to look at every relationship in a zero-sum, transactional way. What's in it for me is a question he often asks. Those of us who are, analysts like myself, we don't see the world that way. We think that, there is more to it than that. Economics isn't always about pure bilateral transactions. There are sort of larger global norms and rules that one has to think about when you think about relations with any one country, because it's part of a bigger picture. So on the one hand, I think India, of all the countries in the world, is in a better place in a Trump presidency than, for example, a European country. But I don't think India should be absolutely complacent. For Indians and policymakers in India watching this, very important to understand how to deal with Trump, how to understand that Trump is a transactional leader. And in any such sort of discussion with a transactional leader, you have to make clear what is in it for them. And I think that's how the Indian government knows how to do this, but they'll have to be very careful to adhere to that approach.
Let's spend a moment on the United States and China. We're seeing already China trying to improve ties with India. Their calculation probably was that Trump is coming back to power, and before that, let's mend fences across the border, which seems to be a wise bet in hindsight. But if Trump increases trade tariffs with Beijing, and we saw what happened between 2016 and 20, how do you see the America versus China dynamic play out in a global context over the next 4 years?
So the tariffs, to explain to your viewers, could go up as high as 50% or even 60%. That's what Trump has said on the campaign trail. In reality, it's not that easy to make that happen. There are all kinds of legal maneuvers domestically in the United States that would make it very hard to pull that off.
But he now controls the Senate and possibly the Congress as well. And the Supreme Court says he can do whatever he wants and there's no bar on that.
Sure, but not on trade rules. That will be harder to pull off. And it takes time to pull it off. And there will actually be a lot of opposition. Remember, a whole range of economists have pointed out that that level of tariffs would eventually be ruinous on the American economy and would lead to inflation, the likes of which America hasn't seen in decades. I'm not saying it won't happen. I'm just saying it won't happen as quickly or as easily without opposition as one might imagine. But the Chinese are certainly going to be worried, but I think Americans are worried about it as well. I mean, a tariff basically means goods will instantly become more expensive for Americans and they'll have to turn to other countries. But Trump has also said he would put in place an immediate 10 to 20% tariff on every country. So watch out. I mean, that's going to be a massive roller coaster ride with China. The other two key differences between Trump and Biden or the Harris status quo is that Biden and Harris would have relied a lot more on alliances to try and constrain China's access to semiconductors, to constrain China's rise more broadly. That gets a little bit harder when you have a leader like Trump who is a bit more transactional, a bit more bilateral, rather than thinking in terms of bigger alliances. And then lastly, Taiwan. It is not entirely clear how much Trump is committed to defending Taiwan. He's said this in public. I mean, he could say, for example, what's in it for us? What are we getting out of defending Taiwan? Look at the trade relationship, look at the fact that they're making all the semiconductors, they stole our business. That's one way of looking at it. But the other is that if you look at the people that Trump might put in his national security cabinet, so in the Pentagon, National Security Advisor, State Department, all of the main candidates we're looking at have been very publicly confident that they want to make sure the United States defends Taiwan. So in the next few weeks and months, there's going to be a guessing game about how much power these individuals have, whether it's Mike Pompeo, whether it is Bridge Colby, whether it is Rick Grenell. All of these names that you will learn more about in the following days, their role is going to be critical here.
Ravi Agarwal, taking out time and joining us on a busy morning. Thank you very much. Appreciate this. See you soon.
Pleasure.